I'm going to first introduce to you Matt Posard, and he is the Senior Vice President of Translational and Consumer Genomics at Illumina Inc. So we'll get a nice industry perspective here in terms of personalized medicine, and in particular, I believe that Matt is going to help provide some concrete examples of the way in which sequencing technologies can help to inform the decision-making and the care from early to late stage. So let's please welcome Matt Posard.
Thank you. You got the name right. Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. It's an honor to be here. I'm going to start my timer because I'm known for being late. It's an honor to be here. I'd really like to thank the organizers and the Mayo community for allowing me to be here. I'm going to start with some disclosures. I do drink the Kool-Aid at Illumina. It'll be pretty clear to you when I get pretty excited and amped about the future, and it's because I have a sneak peek in the types of innovations that we're working on, and I also serve on the board for Halozyme Therapeutics. I'm really not supposed to be here today. Joe Beery was supposed to give a talk, which is a fantastic talk. I've seen him do it, and there's a brief portion of his talk on YouTube that I really encourage you to see, because it's very inspirational and doesn't get any personal than the story that Joe tells. So I think because of a scheduling conflict, they asked me to step in. So indulge me for the next 40 minutes. Dr. Abrams showed this quote, and this actually is the very first reference to personalized medicine that I could find. This is about 2,400 years old, and the physicians in the room, I think, are probably sick of seeing it. This was kind of my introduction to personalized medicine when I was a youth, growing up on cartoons. And I really always had been fascinated with the future. And so, not a Trekkie, but I was fascinated with all the science fiction shows that really showed what the future was going to look like. And so I joined the biotech industry about 24 years ago with a molecular diagnostic company that, along with Roche, was kind of on the cutting edge and pioneering molecular-based medicine, mostly for infectious diseases. And I was excited because I actually was not a scientist. I grew up in education more on the business side of things. I was in a mahogany office at a very young age, and 18 months into that job, I was bored out of my mind, and so I wanted to jump into the biotech industry, idealistic, probably a little naive, wanting to make a big difference. And so I joined a company called Genprobe in 1992 that was doing some really exciting things. And along that time period, I was having weekly conversations with my father driving into work, and he's an artist and a writer and kind of a Renaissance guy, so he was proud that his son was in, quote, the biotech industry, and to him, biotech meant all things medical, right? And so we would have these conversations, most of which I couldn't claim to know anything. I was really young, very stupid, didn't have a science background, and I was just trying to sponge as much information as I could, but I started realizing that it really was genetics that probably had the greatest promise, because the protein therapies, the protein immunoassays had kind of hit a peak, and it really was DNA that was underexplored and presented the big promise. And so I'd be going to a lot of conferences very similar to these, and I started realizing that everyone's using the future of way too often. And the reason I agreed to give this talk was because of the theme of this meeting, which was promise to practice. And like you, and like a lot of my colleagues, we are tired of the promises. So to give you a little personal anecdote, the rest of this talk is going to be my vision of how things are changing, my perspective on how things are changing. When this headline came out about 13 years ago, Father calls me up and he's like, hey, Matthew, it sounds like the future has now arrived, right? It sounds like they've decoded DNA and now we know what it means. And I think my father is probably representative of more than a few consumers out there who really believed the mapping of the human genome was going to result in immediate promise to practice realizations. And so I had to remind my father that don't follow headlines, right? This is a headline that actually came out 6 years before the last one, claiming that the future is now. But Time Magazine, God bless them, continues to kind of whet the appetite of consumers for this promise to practice of genetic medicine. This came out in 2003, which was celebrating the 50th anniversary of Watson Crick's. And this is the one that I actually got most excited about. This came out last Christmas. And the reason I got excited about it, again, a bit of the Kool-Aid here talking, is more than half of the top 10 medical breakthroughs from Time Magazine involved genomics. And Illumina has been very fortunate to be involved in most of the research and most of the applications. Not all of it. Life Technologies, PacBio, Roche 454 have made tremendous contributions as well. But 6 out of these 10 happen to involve Illumina technology. So I'll give you a sneak peek of the ones that involve genomic medicine, again, just published from last December. Zit-zapping viruses. We all probably chuckle, but I've got 2 teenage girls. This is the one they cared about. A serious one, decoding childhood tumors, and we'll talk a little bit about this. This is happening today. The Cancer Atlas Genome Project is making tremendous discoveries that are being used in practice. This is one that just gave me goosebumps. It will give me goosebumps as I describe it to you, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the future, but this is an example of a case study where a 50-hour turnaround time, not far from here, occurred in the neonate unit in Kansas City. Breaking down breast cancer, the wonderful finding in this particular study is that genetically, the differences between breast cancer and ovarian cancer, not that significant when it comes to the treatments that are available. And more we're realizing cancer is a disease of the genome and not of the organ. And then this is some fascinating work on the microbiome and a lot of exciting research that's coming out of the interaction between the microbiome and our genome. And from Illumina's perspective, quite encouraging data on what exists outside the exome. So there's a lot of reasons people are focused on the exome. Price is part of it. Clinical utility is a bigger part of it. But you can't find things if you're not looking for them. And so the famous image that has been given before of the evening with the street lamp posts that are lit up, and those being the genes and looking in between those lamp posts. That's what this ENCODE project has really given us a lot of optimism about. And we actually have examples of clinical utility being found outside the promoting regions. So at Illumina, I've been at Illumina now coming up on my 8th year anniversary. And you have to realize, when I joined Illumina, I came from the clinical diagnostics space. And I was surrounded by life scientists and geneticists, and I didn't have the letters after my name like everybody else did in the rooms with me. And they were so focused on research, and we continue to be very focused on enabling research. But 8 years ago, the reason I think they saw some value in me joining was because I really looked at the technology as a means to an end and not a means to a career. And I have a lot of colleagues now at Illumina that look at life the same way, that the technology is an enabler, it's not an end-all. So we do focus quite a bit on how this application of sequence-based technology and arrays, but our focus now is sequencing, is going to really translate in promise to practice that becomes a standard of care. And my goal, frankly, is that we take it for granted one day. When I was involved in the discussions at Illumina, we always talked about early life to late life, right? And as I was thinking about putting this talk together, on fairly short notice, frankly, I thought this is an opportunity to give a new talk that I haven't given before. And so I'm going to talk about examples of where it is being used in practice. Because I'm fed up with the promises too. And I'm fed up, while encouraged when I learn about the future of, I've been in this industry for a couple decades now, and it's time to start seeing the practices, because I've seen in other examples, if you have successes that may not be standard of care yet, and there's enough attention and advocacy for that, and we saw this in the HIV community in the mid-90s, then it becomes standard of care much quicker than it otherwise would. So I focused on conception of Centenarian. I sent in the title to CC, and literally 10 minutes after I sent it in, I kind of knocked myself on the head and I said, you know, you missed it because there actually is practices going on pre-conception, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But the big take-home is genomics is in practice. It is not standard of care, but it's definitely best practice in a lot of institutions, a lot of laboratories, and a lot of businesses offering clinical services throughout the country and throughout the world. So it is in practice. I've given you an example of kind of the big fields right now that are adopting sequence information into their applications, into their endeavors. And the research really is what put Illumina on the map. And our best estimate is that 40% of all research right now is involving, in our space, is involving next-gen sequencing. So there's still tremendous upside growth in research. And all these other areas that I'm displaying for you here right now, we haven't even scratched the surface. Every single one of those, I think most people here are probably now seeing advertisements for 23andMe. They're familiar that Ancestry.com is getting into consumer genetic testing, Nat Geo, Family Tree DNA. Those are kind of the top four. And all of them have ambitions to get a database of 1 million people each. So light years advanced from where we were when those companies were first established, but still a very small percentage of that market. And in cases of cancer, we're talking about case studies of 1 or 2 or 5 or 6 people in each institution. So, you know, it's anybody's guess when the kinds of things I'll be sharing with you become standard of care. But the fact that if you know somebody, if you have the means, and if you happen to be in an institution that is on the cutting edge, like some that spoke to you in the last couple days, we are seeing that this is kind of the reflex protocol that they're using that requires sequencing, either exome or genome. So this is our mission, to advance human health by unlocking the power of the genome. This is where I get to work. I love this slide because it's one of the rare times I actually get to see an outside view of where I work. The cubicle view is not as interesting, but this is where we brew the Kool-Aid. And then these are the offices that we have throughout Europe and Asia-Pac. Brief background on Illumina for those of you that have not heard of us. We still see ourselves as a young startup, believe it or not, just a 15-year-old company headquartered in San Diego. We've been very successful and used that success to reinvest in the business. And so when I started, it was just a few hundred people, and we're now well over 3,000 people. So we used to have a saying at Illumina, at least the analysts that cover Illumina, reminded us of this, that if it has DNA, it's a market, right? Again, the reason I went to Illumina, or the reason a lot of us are there, is to advance the mission of advancing human health. And so this is exploding. It's a multi-billion-dollar business, and while the reason I'm raising that isn't to leave you with the feeling that we see this as a business, it's to leave you with the encouragement that there's a lot of money going into all of these things that you've been talking about, which is necessary to make something standard of care. So we're going to focus on the patient for the rest of my talk. These are actually what I see as the top 4 fastest growing markets with genomic-informed decision-making in the clinic. Reproductive health is the fastest growing, and I'm going to deep dive into each of these sections to give you examples of where it's being used and the frequency that it's being used. Cancer is another fast-growing area, and I'll give you examples of where those resources exist today and the promise of it in the future. And then infectious disease and primarily blood transplant, we are seeing in 2013 as very fast-growing. We're also seeing areas in rare disease diagnosis, chronic disease, risk predisposition, wellness genomes. All of those are growing, but in terms of the masses, for population-level sequencing, we see these 4 as being the fastest growing. So let's peek into reproductive health. This is where you all say, ah. Okay. My kids are too grown up, so I say ah when I see that, because it reminds me of the good old days when they didn't talk back to me. All right, so we're going to start with preconception, so carrier screening. We know in the Ashkenazi Jewish population, the Orthodox Jewish population, many countries in the Middle East require carrier screening before one gets married. I actually got a request to go to a Middle Eastern country that I was not thrilled to get the invitation to go to that part of the country, frankly, but as I really dug into it and talked to the representatives of that country, they're extremely serious about sequencing the entire population because this is such a big problem for them. We know that infertility is becoming a bigger and bigger issue, and because of that, we're seeing a lot of IVF that's happening. So this is PGS, stands for pre-implantation genetic screening or diagnosis. And my cousin is a 40-year-old woman who went through IVF and is an example of somebody who, without me telling her to, or telling her that it's available, sought out this service. And so they actually are doing chromosomal abnormality detection at the embryo level before there's implantation. And there is data to suggest that when you pick out the, quote, abnormal embryos and implant the ones that appear to be healthy, you have a stronger success rate. And in her case, I think they created 10 eggs, 3 of which actually passed that screen. They implanted 2, and those 2 now are twins and my goddaughters. So for IVF, I actually just saw this on the Today Show, I think, last week, where they actually celebrated the anniversary of the first IVF pregnancy, Louise Brown. Where we are today is we estimate a little over 5 million IVF babies are born since the first one. And this is to give you a sense that actually Europe is utilizing ART at a much faster rate on a per capita basis than the United States. We're second, and then on a ratio basis, Australia and New Zealand is third. And so we see this being a very fast-growing market segment. And we also think because the technology's in place right now using genetics, it will become a standard of care. But we're not there yet. Only 3% of all IVFs are using genetics to screen. And because this is largely an out-of-pocket expense in the United States, it isn't an out-of-pocket expense in many countries in Europe, by the way, but in the US it is. We're finding that educating the consumers that this service is available and the data suggests will increase success for the pregnancies is quickly moving to a practice that will become standard of care. Within the fastest growing market of reproductive health, the fastest growing segment in reproductive health is non-invasive pregnancy testing. This is where you can take mom's blood and look for chromosomal abnormalities, trisomy, in the baby. There are 4 California companies that really revolutionized this technology in the last few years. Veronata is one that Illumina acquired earlier this year. I'll speak to the other 3, but all of these companies do a fantastic job offering, a clinical grade product. And the reason this is growing so fast is because the population is growing so fast. So people are still having lots of babies. These are some statistics I pulled off the internet, which shows that there's about 137 million live births, but there's 210 million pregnancies. They're having them later, which means the risk is higher. So this is a marketing slide from Veronata of the pregnancy test. And I've been part of a couple revolutions, I guess, in the diagnostic field in terms of molecular diagnostics, TB testing, HIV testing, heart failure screening. I've been really fortunate to see some novel diagnostics with really quick uptake, and in all those examples, it's never happened as quickly as it's happening in this field. So the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists, ACOG, came out with an opinion piece, from my perspective, in record time. And in their opinion piece, because of the wonderful work that those 4 companies have done in demonstrating clinical trial data, they actually encouraged and recommended that high-risk pregnancies use the genetic technologies that I just walked you through. And it has extremely high specificity and a very, very low false positive rate. The guidelines, I should point out, are not recommending every pregnant woman be tested for this, but I'll tell you those studies are going on right now, and the early data looks extremely compelling, that we are actually optimistic and encouraged that a future opinion piece is going to endorse genetic screening for all pregnant moms. And the payers are following suit. So there actually are reimbursements established in many of the payers, particularly in California, for reimbursement for these tests. Okay, back to the goosebumps again. Sometimes you can't make stuff up, and as I was preparing for the talk this morning, the person that runs the CLIA laboratory in San Diego at Illumina emailed me, and he said that there was a neonate at Stanford, and you and Ashley, who I think some of you may know, asked whether we could rapidly turn around a whole genome for that baby. In record time for us, we received the sample, we generated the whole genome, we did some basic interpretation, but we also gave our raw data to the folks at Stanford, and they're actively right now interpreting that data in hopes of making a diagnosis. So we do believe, particularly for babies that go into the NICU, that sequencing should be a standard of care. And what gives us optimism about that is what's happening at Stephen Kingsmore's CLIA laboratory in Kansas City at Children's Mercy Hospital. So here's an example where he turned around a diagnosis in 50 hours. And just let that sink in. Usually this takes months, if not weeks. And Stephen Kingsmore is pushing that envelope to do this in 50 hours, which received a lot of press. The work that's going on at the Medical College of Wisconsin is phenomenal. They're absolute leaders in this space as well, and this is a quote from Dr. Dimick, who works with Howard Jacob, who spoke to you earlier. And Baylor is doing some fantastic work as well. Baylor focusing more on exome, whereas the folks at MCW are focusing on whole genome. Cytogenetics, genetics has obviously been a part of that industry for a while, and we anticipate that will go from array screening over to sequencing-based genetics in the next couple years. So a couple things I want to talk to you about cancer. It is palpable, the type of commitment we're seeing from Silicon Valley, because the challenge with cancer mostly is in the data and interpreting the data. And when a fallen leader from up there suffered from pancreatic cancer, we had quite a number of people wanting to apply to Illumina. And I think that some of the folks that Dietrich has hired, these are all people that come from big data environments, really with a personal crusade now to improve human health. Because we're losing the war on cancer, at least that's what the statistics suggest, that we should be seeing the kind of cure rates or life extension like we're seeing in heart disease, and we're not. The good news is that the therapeutic pipeline really has never been richer for cancer. So major diseases and disorders are there on the left, and then the subtypes within cancer on the right. And the data does suggest that a successful cancer drug for one tissue type very likely could be successful for another tissue type if it's originated from the same part of the genome. This is an interesting chart that I thought I'd share with you that actually shows incidence of the different types of cancers, and you can see the role that the environment really plays with cancer. So my colleague who put this slide together for me shows that stomach cancer incidence started going down as we started refrigerating food. And you can see lung cancer went up during the craze of smoking and starts going down when the public campaigns to stop smoking started kicking in. But, pancreatic, liver, leukemia is not so successful, although for children, I think the successes are much higher because they'll be detected early. Okay, back to promise to practice. These are examples where cancer sequencing is in clinical practice. Foundation Medicine had a very successful IPO last week. They've been offering CLIA services now for about a year, a little over a year and almost a year and a half. They have their own multi-gene cancer panel, and they're providing reports for physicians. MD Anderson did the unthinkable, which is they started using the word cure as one of their goals, and so they created a Moonshots program and declared within a 3 or 4 year time frame, every cancer patient would get sequenced as part of the protocol. Caris, Clarient, all examples of sequence-based technologies where they offer interpretation services. I think N of 1 is in the house and in the house here today, and they've done a fantastic job in improving the speed and simplicity of the interpretation so physicians don't have to go through information that is foreign to them. TGen really has been on the cutting edge for whole genome sequencing and also in the Stand Up to Cancer Alliance, where for the first time I'm aware of, you've got competing pharmaceutical companies at the table working on a clinical trial, looking at whether whole genome sequencing really can be used as the incremental diagnostic yield factor, if you will, in treating melanoma. And I get a kick out of this one because there's a great piece, I'm not sure if it was on 60 Minutes or one of those news stories, but how Watson, you know, the computer made famous for bringing down the champions in Jeopardy, is now, for certain applications, being used at Sloan Kettering under IRB. The reason I get a chuckle out of this is Thomas Watson, former chairman of IBM in 1958's famous quote is, "I see there being an entire market of 5 computers in the world," right, in 1958. So he's probably rolling in his grave. All right, I'm going to finish my talk on the challenges. This is not the picture, but a representative picture of how I learned to ski. And it was Mammoth, California, and I went up with somebody who was my friend going up the mountain, stopped being my friend after that, and taught me to ski on Black Diamond, first time ever, and I snowplowed, screaming 4-letter words all the way down. But the reason this symbolizes where we are right now is we are already going down this hill, right? All the practices that I've shared with you, we're down this hill, but a lot of challenges remain. The first of which, and the biggest, I think, is many of your colleagues that are not coming to conferences like this. So I'm going to share with you some examples of a survey that was done to kind of make that point. 98% of physicians surveyed last year gave a thumbs up that patient's genetic profile is helpful, but only 10% said that they would be comfortable talking a patient through that information. 74% believed that one could benefit, but they haven't had the genetic test. 63% agreed that genetic testing would give the physician the ability to make a better diagnosis. And you can see, as I start going through these questions, the amount that are neutral starts going higher because they just don't know. And that is the crux, I think, of our biggest challenge in the physician community. They're very smart in identifying what the barriers are. Cost of test reimbursement, Dr. Abrams discussed this, and I think CC covered it in the follow-up questioning. It is unresolved, right? The pot isn't big enough to take on genetic testing and interpretation services. It has to come from somewhere else. And so the studies have to demonstrate cost savings or cost avoidance to actually be successful and be reimbursed. So here's how I rank our role in industry to make the promise of genetic medicine a routine practice. We have to make it easy for everybody, including the physicians, the clinical geneticists, and the patients. There has to be reimbursement in place. There has to be an abundance of evidence-based medicine that drive the guidelines and the payers to justify coding this. And there has to be, frankly, clarity from industry as well as the FDA on how we're going to prove things. And that is the essence of the N of 1 paradox. The right image is kind of the typical way we prove things: cases, controls, a captive population, placebo, agent, etc. And on the left, which is an example of the extreme one could take with Mike Snyder at Stanford, who sequenced everything, looked at everything in his ohm. you can't possibly do clinical trials with genetic medicine the way we've done them routinely. And so there's a lot of discussion and debate, and frankly, it's not moving as quickly as it should. But we need clarification on how we're going to prove clinical validity and accuracy for all the different iterations one can come up with a genetic profile. All right, this is where you throw tomatoes at me. Thank you, Dietrich, for setting me up for this one. The $1,000 genome is within sight, but let's be blunt. That's just a part of the cost structure. Sending the sample, extracting the DNA, sending the data, storing the data, interpreting the data, delivering the data. All of that is the price target that we all need to be targeting. 23andMe and Ancestry.com sell a test for $99. I know what we charge those companies, and I'm pretty close with those companies, and I know what their profit or lack of it profile looks like. And I'll tell you, everyone's talking about how low can we get consumer pricing. No one's talking about how low can we get the collection kit that people spit into, that price down, or how can we get UPS rates to lower their prices. Because those are the two companies, frankly, making more money on consumer genomics right now than anybody else. And so this is really a community effort where we have to lower pricing. Illumina, I promise you, it has done our part. We will continue to do our part. And pricing pressure and competitive pressure is part of what forces us to lower price. But frankly, the bigger part is innovation. And so every time we come out with innovation, whether it's a new sequencer, higher output, lower cost structure for us, we have an incredible track record over the last 7 years where we always lower one's price per G when we make those innovations, and I promise you those innovations have only just begun. Okay, I think I'm over my time. I'm going to go very quickly so we can get into maybe the post-discussion here, but these are examples of centers of excellence and all the different types of applications for sequencing. You can see Mayo is featured here, and some reputable institutions in your neighborhood are represented here. These are the ones that are going to pave the way and create kind of this tidal wave, I think, of other institutions coming on board. I'm going to skip through this pretty quickly because I think Dietrich did a fantastic job, but our vision is that point of singularity where information yesterday is outdated today is only going to be enabled if we're constantly sharing and enriching this database with phenotypic information, outcomes information, as well as the sequence information. So the Understand Your Genome event is where I will close because it really does address what I see as the biggest barrier, and that's physician buy-in and understanding. So we experimented with an idea last October where we actually took our abilities to sequence human genomes. We subsidized the pricing of this program. People came, paid out of pocket. I paid out of pocket. Other Illumina executives paid out of pocket to go through this. And for $5,000, you got your genome interpreted. And instead of getting this foreign cryptic file that only Dietrich and his team really can make sense out of, we download everything into an iPad app called the My Genome app, which is on iTunes for 99 cents. My Genome, and our CEO's genome is up there so people can invade him. And you'll get a sense of what you could do with your own genome, but you literally can surf your own genome in your hand. So every time Elaine Martis or Howard Jacobs is up here giving a talk, and they're talking about SNPs or regions that are possibly pathogenic for a newly discovered association with a disease, you can now type things in and become the true narcissist we all are and see if it in fact affects you. This is kind of a chromosomal map, so people that like images, you could see all the chromosomes right here, and there's really easy to see icons. Literally, you just touch it, it goes to that part of the genome, describes the disease, and if you're a nerd and you really want to understand the cytobands and the gene structure and all the rest, that's there for you. And if you're just ignorant like me and you just want to know just the facts, it gives you that too. Okay, so as I said, we experimented with this in October. We had some, by design, very high-profile people attend that we wanted to be critical. We wanted them to point out the flaws because as this goes mainstream, we wanted to get it right. and the reviews were spectacular. So we started scaling this. We just did our first one in London a few weeks ago. This is what our calendar looks like for 2014, and what we're seeing is the more we can get physicians and professionals in the genetics industry familiar and over the intimidation wall of understanding one's genome, then the more likely they are to embrace this. So, to be a total hypocrite, I will finish my talk on more promises, okay? So, we know that sequencing is beginning to directly save lives. That's already happened. This is a talk our CEO gave 2 years ago. The radical acceleration in the rate of genomic discovery and insights, I showed you that chart where we're seeing publications every week in genomic associations, and there's never been more money going into genetic research than it is today. So we think that's going to continue to go up. Because of the stake in the ground from the comprehensive cancer centers, we do believe that sequencing of cancer patients will become routine in the next 5 years. There are already 2 nations that have publicly said that they want to sequence all of their populations. Completing a human genome. So let me be very clear. When we say completing it, we mean the cost of the machine as well as the information that comes out of it. We do believe you can do all of that for under $1,000 in the next 3 years. Infants routinely sequenced at birth. That is happening at some hospitals in the country. But there needs to be more data to make that standard of care across the country. And then cancer succumbing to new technologies to where cancer can become a chronic disease and not a fatal disease, we definitely think now is within reach more than ever. So I'd like to finish my talk on somebody that I assume most of you in this part of the country are familiar with, focusing on practice to promise. It really is all about practice, practice, practice. And that inflection point is never more alive than it is now, so I will finish with his famous quote, "Practice does not make perfect, perfect practice makes perfect." Thank you.
Thanks very much, Matt. And, I was concerned when you said the audience was going to start throwing tomatoes at you. Thought maybe we'd have another alarm go off. By the way, we have Google backstage, and we did a little Googling, and it turns out you're going to be hearing that alarm every Wednesday at 10, folks. Just saying. Okay, so Matt really covered you covered a lot of ground in short order, so thank you. I think, though, we've got a number of questions coming in, but somebody's shaking their head, so maybe they're not going to come up here on the screen. There they are. I knew we had questions coming in. Why don't we get right to them since we're trying to keep on schedule here. The first one, Matt, do you see the whole genome or the whole exome sequencing offered by direct consumer companies in the future?
I do. It is technically offered today. I think for it to take off, what we've all learned is consumer appetite, and you're all consumers, but you're not the consumers I'm talking about. I'm talking about my kids, that are spending all their time buying iPad apps and hanging out at the mall. Anything over $99 generally does not make for a good business for the consumer companies. So where I actually see things going is that whole genome sequencing or whole exome will be offered, but not the way one generally thinks about it. I think what's going to happen is a consumer is going to have the need for 2 or 3 bits of information in Twitter-sized bytes. They will send their saliva sample in. Whole exome or whole genome will be done, but only delivered the 3 bits of information they wanted. And now they've got that consumer basically engaged in a relationship where anytime they want anything else throughout the rest of their life, they just tap in to the information that's already been sequenced.
Productizing, that's a neat concept. Next question here. What criteria do you suggest health systems use to select who to partner with in the personalized medicine space to deliver better care, education for care providers and patients and researchers? So this notion of partnerships and who can help bring this information to people very close to the ground.
Yeah. It's ironic because I have a lunch meeting with some of the folks here at Mayo to talk about something similar.
Excellent.
I think most partnerships don't work. And part of the reason they don't work is because there isn't a strong chemistry, there's not synergy in the core objectives of each party. And so too many partnerships start because you're the leader, let's just make great things happen. And I do believe there has to be an honest conversation about what do you want out of this partnership, and is that synergistic or threatening with what I want out of it? Assuming that gets solved, then it really does come down to the personal chemistry, because every partnership is going to be faced with challenges and disappointments and all the rest, but if you have that trust with the core stakeholders on each side, those are the partnerships that I see moving forward. And in our field, I would say that even though I'm a for-profit company, Mayo needs to run a business. Anybody else at the table generally has a fixed budget. You have to be very transparent in terms of what your budgetary options and flexibility points are. And Illumina's mission really is to make public all of this data. And I think you have to be clear about that, because not everybody wants to make the data public.
Sure. Different goals to line up. This is a topic that, of course, has come up in a number of different forms over the last few days, and it speaks to the ethics of this field of research. And our questioner asks, does your company have resources focused on the ethics component of the services that you offer?
We hope so. We created a CLIA lab in 2008 or 2009, and we spent 2 years creating a ethics advisory panel, and we had people that were completely against the service, part of that panel, and we had representatives from NIH as well as other government institutions, and they forced us to think through a tremendous number of scenarios that we never would have thought of. For example, who owns a genome? If a patient sent theirs in and that patient passes, well, then who owns that genome?
Right.
And if that genome implicates siblings, what are the responsibilities of the company to notify those siblings of those genetics? So I think the slippery slope with ethics is one can always come up with something that you haven't thought about. But in terms of our commitment to it really drove the whole decision and how we provided these services.
And as part of the ongoing dialogue at Illumina?
Yeah, this committee meets regularly, and we all now have good relationships with them. When something comes up that we didn't anticipate, we bring them into it.
Bring them into the conversation.
There's also lawyers on this panel as well, and things still got done.
Good. You spoke a bit earlier about an entire population, for instance, in the Middle East. And one of the folks in our audience says, how would you go about sequencing an entire population? What would it take?
Well, there's a lot of ways to answer that. On the infrastructure side, you would need a sequencing factory, and we can provide that. And we actually have some plans on how to do this at a massive scale in the future. But you need the infrastructure, and that includes things that Illumina can bring to the table, as well as other third parties that have to bring the whole data housing and computation part to it, as well as the interpretation side that we saw from Dietrich's talk. So there's infrastructure that we're very good at, but then there's political, right? And every jurisdiction is different in terms of how they're going to do the sequencing. Is there a release? Is it consent? Is it informed consent? And there's 3 states that I've actually had discussions at the governor's level on things like this. Blue states, red states, actually, and everyone's different. And so you have to individualize the plan for that population.
These are states that would consider trying to get their entire state population sequenced?
Or subpopulations at risk for certain diseases.
Okay, because that I can understand the motivation. I was trying to figure out what the motivation of a governor for his or her entire state might be.
So the motivation certainly is there for pregnancy testing, newborn screening, people that are at risk for the diseases that are chronic and very damaging to the budget.
Costly.
So diabetes, cardiovascular disease, mental illness, these are all areas that It's very early days, but they're all very interested.
Okay. Final question to keep us on track, and this is, I'm so tantalized by this question. Like in science fiction, in the near future, do you think carrying genomic and other medical data in a skin-grafted tiny chip is far-fetched?
Nothing's far-fetched, I guess. But I don't think that's the way, at least people much, much smarter than me don't envision it that way. The way they envision it is, today it's iPhone, tomorrow it may be a glass, maybe there's something embedded in our brains one day. But this concept of singularity is one where it has me fascinated, right? Because we all remember the days where you basically had 6 months of information, and then next 6 months, because of computer innovations, everything changed. And then it was 3 months, and then the 24-hour news cycle. We're getting to this point where information yesterday is outdated today. And so a chip that's static probably isn't in the future, but a real-time assimilation using massive big data databases to figure out where you are at a given time and what choices you probably want to make clinically, I don't think it's far-fetched.
Wonderful. Well, Matt Posard, thank you very much.
Great, thank you.